Hello YouTube. This video is about wiring this control panel, and it means there's going to be a lot of wires. If we just take it apart and look, there's a lot of wires just to start. We haven't even wired anything to it yet, and we got a mess of wires. So what I'm going to start doing is hooking the positive lead for the light to the switch, and we'll start there. Although it may not look like it, but we are making progress. We've got leads to the fan, the water pump, the fuel pump, and headlights wired to switches. We've got the pilot lights wired to the switches. We're about ready to make the connection to the relay that's going to pass power to all the accessories, and I thought I'd show you how I do that. The first thing I do is slide a piece of heat shrink over the wire, and then I've stripped the insulation off the connector, and I put the connector on the wire. I crimp it, and then I solder it. And that's a good connection. Then I slide the heat shrink up over the connector and shrink it down. And this is the main power supply to all the switches. This mess of wires represents the control panel being wired. It controls everything from the water pump to the fan to the fuel pump to the neutral safety switch to headlights, taillights. Everything is in this control panel. And everything on the table here was required to do that. In fact, the control panel is set up such that it can be removed because we have jacks going to all those items. By making this connection, we're connecting the trans brake button and the neutral safety switch in the shifter to the console. This pigtail is going to be taillights and fuel pump, and that will run next. We now have the shifter wired and the fuel pump and rear taillights wired. They're all wired with disconnect jacks that can be pulled through the grommets so that the wiring harness can be removed when we paint the inside of the vehicle. Here we have the control panel out of the car and the MSD box mounted to the cover that covers the transmission. And once again, we've wired with Deutsch connectors so that it can be removed, and all the pigtails can be plugged in. And finally, the power. So now we have the task of putting this harness into the car. Here we are drilling a big hole in the firewall for our wiring harness. We'll file the sharp edge. Put a grommet in so we don't chafe the wires. Start to feed some wires through. So we got a mess of wires here that we've got to run. We've made some progress today. We've got the MSD box wired and the wires running up the firewall. The tack and power for the tack is run over to the driver's side. We have the wires run through the hole we drilled in the firewall. We have wires for the coil and the distributor run. We have wires for the brake lights run to the distribution valve. On the other side, we have wires run down to where we're going to put a jack for separating the body from the frame. And those wires are for the trans brake, the solenoid, the water pump, the fan, and headlights. From the quick disconnect, so that we can separate the body from the frame, we've run wires to two 30 amp circuit breakers. From there, we've tapped power right off the starter, and we have the trans brake wired. Forward of the circuit breakers, we've run two relays, one for the water pump and one for the fan. The car is now wired except for headlights. The console works as it should. None of these switches will work unless the ignition switch is on. If we turn the ignition switch on, then the fan comes on, the water pump comes on, the fuel pump comes on, and if we had headlights, headlights would come on. If we had the ignition on and the shifter is in neutral, it starts. And if we put it in reverse and try to start it, it won't start. If we put it in neutral, it starts as it should, and with the ignition on, the trans brake button works. This is the starter cable from the front of the car, and it is the last connection that we have to make in order to have the car completely wired except for the headlights. And I thought I'd show you how I do that. This is going to be difficult because it's hanging from the car. I can't take it over to the workbench. I got to do it in midair. The first thing I got to do is cut it, and I don't know that I can do this off the workbench. Okay, I can. The next thing I got to do is strip back the insulation so that we can put the connector on. And we don't want to cut any of the copper. So we carefully go around this thing and slice it and remove it, like so. Now what we got to do is put the connector on the end of this without getting any of the strands on the outside of the connector. We want every strand we can get. And it just fits like so. And then we put the crimper on, making sure the lug nut is where we want it, and crimp it. And release it. And we have our connector on the end of the cable. Now we'll put some heat shrink on the end, and we'll use red because this is positive, and shrink it down. Now we'll feed it up through the hole in the bottom of the trunk and connect it to our shutoff switch. And now the starter is connected to the shutoff switch with a cable that runs underneath the car. So the wiring essentially is done. The last job is to put all this wire inside plastic loom so it looks good. I've done this portion of the wiring harness in a wire loom so you can see what it looks like. But I'm not going to do any more because we're going to have to take it all out when we powder coat the frame and paint the body. The car functions, all the electrical pieces work. I think we accomplished what we set out to do. If you enjoyed this video, there'll be more.